So today we're looking at 5 different types of graphics: photo, illustration, chart, graph, and diagram. We will look at the definition and when to use these different types of graphics, and then we're going to look at some examples of when to use the graphics and when not to use the graphics. So if you'll take notes on these slides and write down on the worksheet the times when to use graphics and when not to use graphics. So the first type of graphic is a photo, and it's a real-life picture, and it's taken with a camera. When should you use a photo? Well, it's an appropriate graphic if there's a biography, so if it's a person who's a real-life person and we want to see a picture of them. If the text is written in descriptive mode, if that means that it's describing an object or a person in great detail. If it's comparing and contrasting two different things and you really want to see the details of those two things, or if it's advertising a product and you want to see the real product so that the consumer can get an idea of what they're trying to buy. So when I look at this first text and this first photo, I need to figure out why is the photo an appropriate graphic here. So when I look at the text, it talks about the Roman Pantheon. It describes it as an influential building. It talks about the bricks, when it was built, who built it, Hadrian, and he built it to replace one of his friends' structures. So he also describes some of the inscriptions on the side, and it also talks about some of the sculptures that would have been on the building. So I know that this text is written in the descriptive mode. And then when I look at the picture, I see some of the inscriptions here that it talks about in the text. It also, I see more clearly some of the details. So because of this, I know that the text is written in the descriptive mode, and I also know that the picture is showing some of those details. It's helping me to gain more information about this structure. So that's why I've chosen the descriptive mode. Now, I've given you all the answer. Please write this down on your sheet. On the next one, I'm also going to model for you how to decide when not to use a photo. But then on the following ones, there's going to be guided release. So you're going to have to come up with your own answers. Okay, so now I need to figure out why a photo is not an appropriate graphic for this text. So I know that the text is the cost of living. It's the cost of living in Missouri, because it talks about here that Missouri has the 16th lowest cost of living in the United States for this year. And it also talks about how they looked at other areas of the country to see what the cost of living was there. And then it talks about the different organizations they use, American ACRA, to survey and to find this information. So this is an informational text. There's a lot of numbers in here, so maybe I should see something with those numbers. But I see my picture up here is actually a picture or a photo of Missouri's football team. So that doesn't really have anything to do with the cost of living. So because of that, I see that the topics are not equal. Okay, so the topics, it's not on topic. All right, so please write that down on your paper. On the next one, you're going to have to write down your own answer. Okay, so if you'll go back to your notes and write down our next type of graphic, which is an illustration. An illustration is a drawing or a painting. So when is an illustration an appropriate graphic? Well, if there is no photo available, either because what we're talking about existed before cameras were invented, or it doesn't exist at all, so it's fictional. So if you were reading about a fictional or fantasy genre book, like Twilight or Lord of the Rings, something like that, those places do not exist, so an illustration would be appropriate. Also, if there's an image of a painting, or if there's a fictional character kind of going along with the fictional world, if there's a map, obviously it's difficult to tell directions if there's just a photo of different streets. So you would want the different roads drawn out, like in this picture. Also, a cartoon obviously would be an illustration, not a photo. Okay, so why is an illustration an appropriate graphic for this text? So I see that the text is talking about stegosauruses, which are dinosaurs. And it talks about this type of dinosaur, gives some information, what the name means, how fast it could run, size of its brain, etc. So I want you to tell me now, why is this illustration an appropriate graphic? Pause it, please. Okay, so you should have put down that it's an appropriate graphic because dinosaurs did not exist when there were cameras. So dinosaurs were not in existence. When there were cameras. So that's why you need to have an illustration. Okay, so now why is an illustration not an appropriate graphic here? So here we have Adolf Hitler, and then it has some information about him and his life, that he was the dictator of Germany, when he was the dictator, his life. It talks about his birthday, who he was married to. So this is kind of biographical. And I also see this illustration here. So why do these two not go together? Pause it and tell me. Okay, so what you should have said is that an illustration is not an appropriate graphic here because there are photos of Hitler and it's a biography. So we have photos. And the text is biographical. Okay, on to our next type of graphic. Okay, so if you'll go back to your notes, a chart is our next type of graphic. It's used to organize or categorize information. When would you use a chart? So you would use a chart if you are giving a timetable or some kind of schedule of something. You would also give a chart if you're trying to categorize information or show a relationship between different categories or different items. So you can see over here, this is categorizing different types of animal or dog paw prints. So if you wanted to order a boot for your dog, so this is from a website that's selling dog boots, then you would look and see which size your dog's foot is, and it's categorizing that information. So that's why a chart is appropriate here. Okay, so here we have a text, and I want to know, why is a chart an appropriate graphic? So this text talks about planting by the moon, and so it talks about above ground crops that are planted during the light of the moon versus below ground crops that are planted during the dark of the moon. And it talks about when you should plant those. So when looking at this chart, it also tells us different types of crops, dates to start them indoors, and then moon favorable dates. So it compares and contrasts those two dates, and then when to put your plants outdoors. So now I want you to tell me, why is it appropriate? I'm not going to tell you the answer this time. Pause it and write your answer. Okay, great. So we're going to go on to our next one now, and we're going to look at why a chart would not be an. Okay, so why is this chart not an appropriate graphic for this text? Well, here we have a text that's talking about Orchidaceae, which is part of the orchid family. And it describes that. It talks about the different families in that type of family. It talks about the different descriptions of the orchids. And then over here we have a chart that is charting the life cycle of a plant, and it puts the different phases and different categories of the plant. So tell me, why is it not appropriate? Pause it here. All right, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next chart, or I'm sorry, the next graphic, which is graph. Okay, so we're going to talk about graphs now. A graph tracks numbers, change over time, and compares statistics. Think math when you think about graphs. So the difference between a chart and a graph, because these are the most commonly confused. A graph is more focused on numbers and change. It tracks change over time. It also compares and contrasts. So those three things are when you should use a graph versus a chart. All right, so now I want you to identify why is a graph an appropriate graphic. Okay, so here we see up here Obama versus Romney compared to Obama versus McCain. So I want to help you guys kind of figure out how to read this graph because it's a little bit difficult to read. So I know that it's Obama versus Romney, and we're comparing to Obama versus McCain. So here I see that these lighter are going to be these dotted lines right here. So McCain is the dotted red, Obama is the dotted blue. Then this darker line here is Obama versus Romney. So we have two different campaigns going on here. So the dark lines are one campaign. The dotted lines are a different campaign. So it's comparing these two campaigns. So I want you guys to tell me, why is a graph an appropriate graphic? Okay, great. So now we're going to go on to when a graph would not be appropriate. Okay, so why is a graph an appropriate graphic here? So this is talking about Obama versus Romney compared to Obama versus McCain. So these are Obama's two different campaigns. And so here, this is how we're going to figure out how to read this graph. So here with the lighter, we see that Obama is this dotted, the dotted line, the dotted blue line. McCain is the red dotted line down here. Then the darker lines are Obama versus Romney. So this top line and this top line. So we see the two different campaigns plotted on this same graph. So why is this an appropriate graphic? Pause here. Okay, awesome. So you should have written that down. Now we're going to go to why a graph is not an appropriate. Okay, so why is a graph not an appropriate graphic? So a graph, this graph over here, it's talking about an overall football program. So it talks about the coaching, current talent, recruiting, title path, and program power. And then it gives the overall score of that actual program on a scale of 100. So this is a pretty good program. Now over here we have a text, and it's specifically talking about Jarvis Landry and the awards that he has won, MVP. He also, it gives some of his statistics, and it talks about the kind of player that he is. So this is talking about one player, Landry, whereas this is talking about a whole program. So why is this graphic not an appropriate graphic? Pause here. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's go back to our notes for the last time. This is our last type of graphic, a diagram, and it's used for labeling or for instructions. So when should you use it? If you're labeling parts, if you're showing chronological order, so a timeline, could be a diagram. And if you're talking about something scientific, most of the time you find diagrams in biology or ecology textbooks showing different parts of a process or different parts of the body or an animal, etc. Okay, so why is a diagram is a diagram an appropriate graphic? I'm sorry. So here we have the different parts of a flower and then their definitions. So over here we have those different parts labeled on the flower. You guys can see those parts matching up. So why is this diagram appropriate for this text? Pause here. Okay, awesome. Now we're going to look at when not to use a diagram. Okay, so why should you not use a diagram here? So we have a text and it's telling a story about ladybugs and how this person saw ladybugs right after her mother died and talking about what she was going to share with her sisters. And then down here, we have the different parts of a ladybug labeled. So why is this not appropriate? Why does it not fit with the text? Pause and answer.